Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Meebits Podcast. I'm Sergio, and I'm excited to be here today with Adam Levine, the director and CEO of the Toledo Museum of Art, a place that honestly I had never heard about before this year. And I visited in the fall for their latest exhibition featuring digital art called Infinite Images. And I cannot wait to go back, not just to the museum, but to Toledo, Ohio as well. Adam, thank you so much for being here with us today. Welcome to the Meebits Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Let's jump right into it. You are the youngest museum director at 38 years old, which seems to be something that every article kicks off with when they feature you, which is funny to me because, for us, I think, we're the same age. In this world of NFTs and digital art and crypto, we're on the older side. So as you made your way through the art world, how does being like a millennial impact what you've done so far?
Yeah, so I find it as peculiar as you do. So I guess a couple things. One is I'm not sure I'm the youngest museum director. I think there was a time when when I first became a director, but I don't know. I'm skeptical. As a good friend of both of ours, Snowfro is, of ever saying you're the first, right? You're the youngest. Don't use superlatives, right? Or don't use sort of extremes. You never really know. And there are 43,000 museums in the United States. And more people go to museums than to sporting events every year. I mean, it's a big number. So, I am absolutely certain that there is a small museum somewhere that has a younger director. So I'm not. But with that said, yeah, I think that I'm a younger director of a large museum. But that also, I think, misses the point. Because, I've now been the director of the Toledo Museum of Art for 5.5 years, and I was the director in Jacksonville for almost 2 years. So, at this point, I have some longevity relative to average tenure. And I think that's the more relevant thing is, age is one marker of experience, but there are many better markers, I think. And I have been a museum director long enough to know that listening or following trends is something museums are really bad at. And I think that's really sort of the origin story of this conversation. Yes, I'm a millennial. Yes, I think about technology in a native way. Yes, I have been following cryptocurrency, NFTs, et cetera, earlier than most of my peers. And some of that is age correlated, but it's not dependent on age, right? All of those trends are available for anyone to follow. So I do think this idea of plugging in to where things are going rather than responding to where things are is key to leading any organization, a museum or otherwise.
I love that. And let's just put it all into context, I guess. Toledo, as I mentioned during the opening, not a place that comes top of mind for most people outside the art world. But it is, as I learned when I was there, quite a prominent place. What is it about Toledo's history that makes it so important for the art world, for the industrial world? Just to give some background to our audience here before we kick off on the broader conversation.
Yeah, of course. So look, the Cliff Notes version is Toledo is the city where glass was industrialized. And that wealth was sort of invested in a civic infrastructure that included remarkable arts platforms, chief among them, the Toledo Museum of Art. So the Toledo Museum of Art, while it hasn't been as well known over the past couple of decades in the mainstream, has long been considered one of the great art museums in the world. Its distinguishing characteristic is that it has sought since 1912 to have only artworks of superlative quality. So, like, simple version, we don't try to have one of everything. We try to have only the best. And that is, that results in a collection that spans human history, 6,000 years, 6 continents, but every single work is as good as anything you would see anywhere else. So we have only one Monet water lilies. We don't have 80 of them, but it's as good as you can imagine. That's sort of the model of the museum. And that spans media, sculpture, prints, text, or works on paper, paintings, etc. And it goes without saying that, as artists experiment with other media, particularly in contemporary practice, whether that's film, whether that is, born digital, secured on blockchain, right? Those are all things that need to be reflected in an art history that values quality wherever it comes from, whatever medium it's in. What makes Toledo really special, though, in addition to that sort of collection and therefore that sort of national, international platform that the institution provides into the art world, is that we're a little bit off Broadway. As you just said, Sergio, you hadn't heard about us, you weren't that aware, which actually allows us to take some risks. And we have an exceptional board who has been incredibly supportive of, pushing our historic focus on quality in broader directions. And that's not just including digital art, that's across the board. But it's a place where you can try things, right? And you don't necessarily have the same spotlight on you. If we get it right, we get credit. If we get it wrong, then no big deal. We learn and we pay it forward. It's kind of a perfect sandbox then, because it's a place where you can try new things. And if they don't work, no big deal. But if they do work, you can leverage them into the broader museum conversation because we are a significant institution. And I think the last thing to say is, while the museum opened in 1901, it wasn't until 1912 when it moved into its current location that it was really focused on quality. So everything I say about the Toledo Museum of Art, your audience should know, is said from a born and raised New Yorker. I'm not a native Toledoan, right? So my passion for this place doesn't come from having gone to this museum every day, or every weekend growing up. It's truly exceptional, as you experienced. And it's as you also said, just like a truly remarkable place where the people are great and you can really get things done and can really transform the art world if you wanna lean into it.
Yeah, no, it really came across as special the places. Again, I was actually pretty jet lagged coming back from Japan, and almost missed the weekend. But I'm glad that I went because it really opened my eyes. Obviously you mentioned you follow crypto, NFTs, just the overall art market. It's kind of like right now not feeling too good from kind of like a price and activity side of things. It's something that you read about a lot. One of our really good friends of the Meebits, a Meebit holder himself, friend of yours as well, Benny Redbeard, just wrote an excellent article quite recently about, there's not a lot of buyers. And I feel like a lot of our digital art slash NFT world really relies on that kind of like price performance, economic activity as an indicator of whether things are good or bad. But obviously you as a museum director and the museum itself, you guys are thinking, hundreds of years. So how do you not only internally yourself within your team, but as you go out into the community into like these new worlds as NFTs, how do you kind of like marry both things, like the day to day of the art world of potentially like the new, entrants into the market that are younger that might care a little bit more about price performance, and then the more established things that you guys still have to deal or contend with as an established institution.
Yeah, so I don't view those things as separate at all, right? I think that's one of the traps, right? And I even think you started the conversation, right, the pod with a question about my age, right? And then sort of in that question suggested that collectors of digital art are going to skew younger. And while that may be true, right, actually what we want a world where everyone collects everything, right? It shouldn't be a headline when younger buyers are buying old master paintings, and it shouldn't be a headline when older collectors are collecting digital art. The headline should be collectors buy great art, regardless. So that's the way we think about it at the Toledo Museum of Art. And I think we have moved into the space in ways that are thoughtful and visible. But we've collected 1,300 works of art in my tenure, of which like 15 have been NFTs. So, the vast majority of what we're collecting is all the other stuff, which for the avoidance of doubt is not because NFTs are not important, is not because Web3 isn't important, but because over 6,000 years, even given all the art being produced today, that's about the right percentage, 15 of 1,300. So we have an obligation. It is literally in our DNA and it is in our founding documents. That's not quite true. It's, as I said, there's a distinction between 1901 and 1912, but in some of our early sort of early mandates to reflect the world. So that's what we seek to do at the Toledo Museum of Art. And I just don't see there being a division, and I don't see it being challenging. The question, so to channel your question in a different direction, so how do you structure around that is, I think, a more interesting question. And the answer is you create equity and access to resources for curators pursuing various types of artwork. So we've expanded our curatorial team. We've made sure that we have expertise on our team that can diligence and research digital art, and that is what has allowed us to acquire things, right? So there have been art committee meetings where we have acquired sort of medieval Seljuk Islamic sculpture. We've at the same time we've acquired a Roman sculpture from 1,000 years ago, and we've acquired sort of several NFTs. And then I guess the last thing to say is, so once you've created sort of curatorial coverage and access to resources, with no restriction, so it's a jump ball every time, right? You end up therefore with sort of prorated representation as a function of time, right? Of any medium, of any time period, of any culture, of any geography. The other question is, well, how do you display things? And in our context, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we are breaking down medium-based divisions. So it's important to see artwork in the context of other artworks that engage with it. So I already brought up Snowfro. It's a really great example. While Eric will share, quite a bit about sort of his interests and his influences in creating, say, chromie squiggles, including, Coachella Valley Light, right, et cetera. There are other artists who respond to that, right? The light and space movement in California, beginning in the mid 20th century, but continuing to today, right, are responding to those same light sources, those same colors. And there's an artist, Philip K. Smith, who's producing, right, in Palm Desert today. He's got an incredible studio, and we have a work of his in the collection. And it's a light work. And to put our chromie squiggle, which is a ghost, right, next to this sort of beautiful acrylic work that changes lights, also reflecting sort of sunset, sunrise into Coachella Valley, even though Eric wasn't thinking about Philip K. Smith's work, is a meaningful art historical connection. Right? Similar things can be done with Yatreda in our collection, and thinking about how that engages with contemporary history painting, of which there are examples, or with historic Ethiopian art, which we have in the collection. So it's about providing context that enriches and enlivens the histories that these objects are engaging with. And we have a collection, because it is so broad, that allows us to do that. So whether it is on the acquisition, the display, or just the conceptualization, we don't subscribe to some of these same divides. And I think the more we reify these divides, the more they become real. The opportunity is to just treat art as art. And then we will find more collectors, because collectors will say, oh, wow, it's not about digital versus physical. It's about my interest in Ethiopian art. It's about my interest in light and space. And there are a lot of people who are interested in those things, right? And it's not to say that there aren't people who are just interested in digital, just like there are some people who are just interested in works on paper. But if we can find these thematic connections, then we'll grow the market. And we're not doing it to grow the market. We're doing it to tell an art history. But a secondary effect, right, will be that we'll grow interest and hopefully grow the market.
Well, that context that you mentioned, I think, was quite clear in the Infinite Images exhibit, because of how you started just everything that you put out there. It was not just, like, to your point, squiggles, but Barry Molnar's art and some other, like, pioneers in the digital and algorithmic space, and really helped somebody like myself with a more recent art experience contextualize where these things were coming from and why they are kind of like that next part of the next steps in the history of art. So I really appreciated that, and I really hadn't thought about it before too much. And I do want to go into the Infinite Images exhibit here at length next. But before we move on to that, I would love to, you mentioned before we started the conversation that your actual, kind of like background is on ancient artifacts. And to me, that's just so interesting because, obviously you're now, one of the leading or pioneering museums into this next era, but your own personal background is ancient artifacts. So I would love to just kind of hear from your perspective, how do those two, play together, or how that experience has helped you navigate this new world.
Yeah, well, so my background is in ancient art, right? So that's what I did I wrote my undergraduate thesis, master's, PhD in, began my career in the Greek and Roman department at the Met before coming to Toledo for the first time. Was here, left, and then came back. and was at one point the curator of ancient art in Toledo before becoming a director. So this is sort of like in my DNA. I guess two things are important there. One is especially running a museum like Toledo, where the focus is on the highest quality artworks. And I have 120 years of history to live up to. Right, every director before me did a bang up job of it. So right, there's nowhere to hide. You buy something not great, you put it on the wall next to something great. It shows. I have definitely had aesthetic experiences in front of works of art. I think very deeply with our curatorial team about what constitutes quality. I consider myself to have a good eye, all those things. But what got me into art history was this idea that objects tell stories about the time in which they were created, what you would call the social history of art. Um, uh, and so I was quite interested in antiquity, not in, how artists made the most beautiful artworks. I was interested in what artworks could tell you about the cultures in which they were produced. And that stays with me because in antiquity, you don't get to read what the artist said, right? It is very seldom that you have the actual intention of the artist described. And in fact, what I did a lot of was I studied how people likely would have received the image, right? So think or what you would call sort of like reception theory, so much more about the viewer. And that I think has really put me in a place to think about museum practice in a different way. And it actually affects directly the way I've thought about infinite images. There is another interview out there, I forget with whom, where I make this point. But infinite images was an opportunity for us to introduce our audience to digital art, not as an end in itself, but to condition our audience to understand digital art as it shows up in increasing proportion in our galleries, right? So it becomes a reference point. So really thinking about how you graduate a viewer into deeper understanding of a visual culture, of a visual context, is actually part and parcel of sort of the way I thought about ancient art. But the second part of the study of antiquity, which I think is really important, is it grounds you in history. And it is so easy nowadays to get stuck in like the cycle, right? Or the moment. And it's really important to zoom out and realize like all this stuff, all of it has history. Um, so I don't know if you saw the recent news that the American Numismatic Society is going to be moving to Toledo, Ohio. So this is the oldest such society in this country, the fourth largest in the world. It's basically a $1 billion collection of 800,000 coins, everything from the first coin ever produced in 8th century Persia all the way up to counterfeit banknotes made yesterday. They've been in New York City since the 1850s, and they're moving to Toledo, Ohio. They're moving onto our campus, and it's going to be a great partnership. It's not like cryptocurrencies, the first currency ever issued by non-state actors. It's like a whole history, right? And there's this collection that tells that history, right? I mean, which is just and that I could go on, but actually, what studying antiquity makes you realize is, we've seen all this stuff in part before. It is absolutely valid to say that, well, everything is slightly different. Of course it is. But history rhymes, as they say, and it's important to understand, right, the successes and the excesses of history so that we can make better decisions going forward. So that's also, I think, a great benefit of ancient art. Because even if I don't know, so to give a tangible example, I don't know how everything will play out over the next few years, but knowing I don't know means that we created a part of our organization called TMA Labs, which is run by a guy named Ian Charles Stewart, who is very involved in Web3, but also was one of the leaders in Web2, including as one of the founders of Wired Magazine. So I knew I needed someone around me who was even more plugged into what's happening today than I was, but also who had seen a cycle before. And could sort of share similarities and differences in his perspective of what's happened before. So just wanting to ground oneself in history, I think, is one of the benefits of my study of antiquity.
That makes a lot of sense. I personally like, human behavioral, just like how cyclical it is. I've never really thought about it in the context that you put it right now, and I think it's really interesting. And I'm just, as you're talking, I'm going back to, my couple of days in Toledo, going back through not just the exhibit itself, but the whole museum. A lot of things are starting to make sense. Like I said, honestly, I cannot wait to go back. Hopefully, when the Mudhens are back in season, because that baseball game was a lot of fun.
Hey, and you know
But
what? But we have an incredible minor league hockey team too, right? The Walleye, which is the Detroit Red Wings affiliate, and it's really fun to watch a game, and you're pretty much guaranteed a fight every game, so it's really really entertaining.
maybe to the winter one.
Yeah, do it.
Talking about moving on to Infinite Images, and for those in the audience who don't know, Infinite Images is an incredible exhibit that actually closed recently or this weekend.
This
It's open
weekend. This is the last weekend. Yeah.
since July. The Toledo Museum of Art. You presented not just NFT art, but really a range of, and it was kind of not just digital, right? I was there's experiential, there was prints, there were physical. Could you give us like the quick 40-second elevator pitch as to what the Infinite Images exhibit was?
Yeah, so Infinite Images is an exhibition on the history of generative art. So it begins with pre-computer work, and also tries to ground that work in sort of the mid 20th century movement towards conceptual artistic practice. So we have important artists like Sol LeWitt, Joseph and Annie Albers, right, Max Bill from our collection reflected, but as a way of providing context for what is the largest display currently in the world of Vera Molnar's work. A really important pioneer who lives to 2023 and actually produces NFTs, and that's the last work of hers that you see. But she really introduces in a pioneering way the idea of randomness as a part of conceptual artistic practice. And that is the jumping off point then for a series of rooms, a series of themes that are explored by the exhibition that really engage with sort of how Web3 has enabled not just the distribution, but also sort of interesting formal challenges in terms of long form generative sort of art that have really come to typify sort of generative artistic practice today. So it's a history of generative art from the 1950s to today. It is not sort of the final say on the matter, but it is, we think, an important contribution. And there is a great online catalog, and there's a print catalog to follow next year. We thought it was important to have something online, but it is also the case that if it doesn't have an ISBN, then it doesn't end up in all the libraries, right? And we're trying to build an art history here, so there will be a print catalog to follow next year. And I think the thing, and I don't want to be too self-congratulatory here, but so Sergio, you have to back me up on this. I think the thing we really tried to solve for on this was it's a real challenge to come up with a display of digital art that causes the artwork to feel like art rather than to just feel like images on screens. And it's very difficult when you have too many screens to not have the artwork compete. So I think our team, Julia Kaginski, the curator, and the Green Isle, and Richard Tay, our exhibition designer, were quite brilliant in coming up with a display that really showed each artwork to its best, that used printed versions of, say, Dmitry Cherniak's Ringers, rather than just showing digital versions, so that we had a bit of staccato, right, a bit of rhythm in the way that things were displayed. Ditto for Tyler Hobbs Fidenzas, right, printed rather than depicted sort of on screen. So I think we really did a nice job of sort of giving artwork space, allowing the artwork to feel like it was artwork in a museum setting. And I think the last thing to say is, and the reason it was largely such a success is because the team worked with every artist that was displayed in the exhibition to figure out what that artist wanted as their optimal display. So things like Casey Reese's Remix, Century Remix, which have been on display in lots of places over the decades since it's been created. This was the first time it was ever displayed the way Casey wanted it to be. So it was a real engineering challenge, a real design challenge, but the team nailed it. And I think that's a really significant contribution as other museums increasingly show work like this in their galleries.
Yeah, no, you guys totally crushed it. It was. it was quite emotional, actually. I think for a lot of us who were not exposed to art before NFTs, which myself included. I didn't really have a background. Grew up in Mexico in art. I've been here in New York over a decade. The most I came close to art was going to basketball parties. And coming in, yeah, but coming in and seeing, for me, QQL actually was one of the standouts because, and I talked to Tyler there at length at that weekend. We actually realized we overlapped in college at UTSA back in the day. But QQL for me was a project that just purely from the NFT angle was not very successful because, in my opinion, the ability to have unlimited outputs diminished from like the perceived value of being able to say there's only 1,000 or 10,000 of these things. But the ways you guys displayed it at the museum, where you can actually play there with the parameters to generate those outputs in a really big screen, which completely changed the way I understood and appreciated the work. And it made me go back and really go through not just the collection that's been minted, but the outputs that I generated when I was playing around with it. And it just completely I was like blown away by that. And then walking over to DevP's glitch boxes and being able to play again and seeing kind of like the music and changing the parameters. It truly was innovative in the sense that it wasn't gimmicky, that I think a lot of the times NFT stuff tends to fall for, but it really felt like we belong, right? Like we feel like we're obviously it's generative, but NFTs, like it finally felt like we were somewhere where we actually belonged. If you walk from that room next to the other room with your ancient artifacts or the really nice paintings that you have, it didn't feel out of place in going from one to the next. So definitely mad props to your creator Julia, your team, and everybody that was involved, because it was. I wish it wasn't closing, man. I'm not gonna lie. Like I wish
Well,
I wish we could go back.
we hope it travels. I think the way this exhibition came together is it came together relatively quickly. So it's actually fairly common when exhibitions come together quickly to take a beat and then sort of try to travel it rather than trying to do it all sort of at once, because museums do have longer planning cycles, and there are very good reasons for that. But yeah, I mean, look, QQL, most people would never, I mean, not most people, no one had ever experienced it at that scale before, right? You experienced it, on your phone, on a computer, maybe. So certainly the scale makes a difference. And that's a good example of, we had the Fidenzas that were printed, that were prints and sort of a grid, next to this incredibly large, and the tech was all great, right? So sort of, it's a reconfigured sort of custom screen from the House of Utreda, that we had installed a couple of years ago, and the interface was super clean, and you really got to experiment with all the parameters in a very visual way. I do, and I think I love the way Tyler pushes people to think about what constitutes style. And sort of, the QQL, I think, really gives insight into artistic process, regardless, digital, non-digital, right? Every artist has a style, and of the infinite possible examples of that style, they pick a thing. So I do think you really get that sense, here. And then, yeah, I mean, the glitch boxes, so it's important to note, while there were multiple lenders to the exhibition, there were also, instances of commissions. And that was one of them, and I think it was super, super successful. And just in terms of craft, right? I mean, it's just out of control, right? Every weld, right? Every visual, right? And all the code, right? That we did it all. He, when he was a little bit nervous driving it to Toledo, if he got stopped, how he was going to explain what this like box was in the back of his car. But it would look a little bit suspicious. But it's really incredible. But I guess, to your last point, the kind of like the most magical moment for me was during the block party. Um, uh, we had a space in the museum that was emptied because we're in the first phase of a massive renovation of the museum for the first time in 40 years, like a gargantuan capital project that will see the whole 250,000 square feet of the Beaux-Arts Museum sort of turned over the course of the next 2 years. So we had a space that had been emptied out, and we used it for an algo rave during the block party. And the line for the algorithm snaked through the galleries, right? And it wasn't just the Web3 folks who were in town, it was everyone, right? For those who were at the block party, it's sort of one of the most magical things. You have 10,000 people from every walk of life, all congregating together, enjoying the museum. But so you have everyone you can imagine, like every walk of life on this line, snaking through the galleries. And, I was there with, a group of people from the space, people, Blondie, a few other folks besides. And we're like talking about Rembrandt paintings, right, that are on the wall while we're waiting to get into the algorithm. And, and yeah, and I think that's what it's supposed to be, right? The idea is not, to an earlier point I made, it's not to create these divisions and say, well, this art is for this audience and that art's for that audience. It's about using both types of artwork in the same space to cross-pollinate audiences, and in so doing, sort of grow both spaces. Grow the number of traditional art lovers who appreciate digital art, which has certainly happened in Toledo, and grow the number of digital art lovers who appreciate traditional art. And I think we made some progress with the show.
It was wild to see, people putting dick butts real time into this piece that was creating every day there at the blog party. They walk in inside and sing a Rembrandt. I didn't make it into the algorithm because the line was so long. But yeah, no, mad props to the success of not just having a lot of consequential people from the space, but really what was so amazing to see, and I'd love to get your take on this, was how the community from Toledo just turned out for the blog party. And for those of you in the audience who might not know, the museum hosted like a weekend where really a lot of us from Web3 collectors, artists, and everybody that's a fan went out, visited. But also, I was shocked to just see literally thousands of community members from Toledo. There were performances, they were going in, they were interacting with the art, we're chatting with each other. It's not something that I experienced before. And what's been like looking back a couple months removed from there? What's experience been like?
Yeah, I mean, look, so this is one of it's always nice to speak with someone who's been to Toledo, because I feel like I talk to a lot of people, right? Whether it's on podcasts, whether it's at conferences, right? And I tell people, no, 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 no. Everyone will use the same words I'm using, but actually Toledo really is special. And then people are like, yeah, whatever, okay, he has to say that, or like Toledo, right? It's Toledo, Ohio, right? Like I've never been there, right? And actually the thing is, people don't have negative views of Toledo, Ohio. They just don't have any views, right? It's just like you don't think about it. It's like terra incognita. And then you go and like you see, right? It's like, the passion with which I speak about it is because like you get infected by enthusiasm for this place. So, and one of the reasons it's so easy to be enthusiastic is, so I mentioned a number of times the quality, focus of the Toledo Museum of Art, sort of the impulse to quality. Well, the other thing that makes Toledo special is from the very beginning, we have centered community. And what that means is it means people love the museum, people respect and trust the museum. We have engaged with our community much more broadly than almost any other museum historically. And that is something that still doesn't mean we're perfect at it, and we continue to improve. And that's been a real focus of ours, reaching into parts of the community that we haven't reached into, as effectively historically, and we make great inroads there. But we're like starting from second base, whereas most museums are like starting at home plate. And you get that sense when you go to the block party, right? It's sort of like everyone is there. And yes, they're there because they're interested in infinite images, sure, but they're mostly there just because they love the museum. And when you have that level of connection and trust, it allows you to introduce new concepts, new ideas. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't bring up that, one of our programs in the Web3 space has been our digital artist in residence program. And one of the places where I think you see this sort of willingness to lean in, this is obviously just a single example, but I think it's generalizable to the community, was in Dan Hernandez, our local artist in residence's sort of incredible work that he produced in conjunction with Infinite Images. And he had as great a mentor as you can imagine, Emily Shee, who's sort of our, national artist in residence. But part of that program is we get a national, international digital artist in residence to come to Toledo, spend a lot of time here and mentor a local artist and onboard that person into Web3. And Dan's embrace of that, I think, is sort of a metonym for the entire community, and how the community is really open to embracing things that Toledo Museum of Art suggests are worthy of embrace. And that's the vibe you got at the block party.
Yeah, and then honestly, that drone show, the squiggle in the sky is probably, if I go back to like almost my 5 years in this space, and I think of the top five moments, seeing the squiggle in the sky with the drone show over the building of the museum, which is a beautiful building to begin with, was again taking it out of the phone screen or the OpenSea website and really putting it in a grandiose setting that just completely changed the way I appreciate the art, but also the way I think I want to share art with others next year, next 10 years, and so on. So yeah, no, thanks again to you and your team for such an amazing weekend. I'm assuming that you're making a lot of noise with not that you're forcing a lot of noise, but that a lot of other museums, especially as we were talking about at the beginning, where art and a lot of the stuff that sometimes tends to be more discretionary is seeing a bit of a slowdown. What are you getting calls from other museums? Are people, obviously the MoMA, for example, had record attendance with Rafiq's piece. What are you hearing from that world after Infinite Images and your approach to digital art and Web3?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to note that we're like one of many museums that are doing things, right? So the Tate obviously had Electric Dreams not that long ago. Buffalo did incredible work, especially when Tina was there. LACMA continues to do significant work with diffuse control there. The Shed is leaning in, right, as well. So we're not alone, and the forces that are shaping artistic practice are going to cause museums to engage with digital artistic production, including NFTs. Period. But since Infinite Images, yeah, I would say that there's definitely curiosity and interest. As I shared, most museums are planned out further, right? So we're gonna start thinking about touring the show. So stay tuned, more on that in the sort of next year or two. But I think it is sort of increasingly clear to people in the market, right? You look at sort of the most recent EBS report and the way that our Basel is thinking about things, right? That there is sort of demand for digital assets and digital art, and that will shape collectors, and that shaping of collectors will in due course shape the museum ecosystem. So there are definitely museums that are thinking about how to get ahead of these things. And sort of without naming names, I would say that there is definitely interest in digital art and in learning more. If I were a listener, I would expect to see more, not fewer, museum shows and acquisitions in the digital art space, but I would not expect a tsunami tomorrow.
Yeah, I almost feel kind of bad for people that like the art but are too financially invested. And when you said there a year or two, my Web3 brain went, dude, that is 2 lifetimes. We need something happening tomorrow. But then I sat here and thinking, wait, it's been only 4 or 5 years of this movement. It's not a long time in the greater scope of thing, going back, thousands of years for all the stuff that's actually sitting in museums. And yeah, I hope people appreciate the art, even if they don't own it, or if maybe right now it's worth a little bit less than they paid for. Because I agree with you. I think it just the future is exciting for digital art from what we're seeing and hearing ourselves over here.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And Sergio, this is one thing that maybe the most controversial thing I'll say or have said on sort of a Web3 sort of interview or podcast, which is I really would question what evidence there is that speed is good, or excuse me, let me say that better. That speed is better. Like I would actually really question what is the empirical evidence over the long term that I'm not saying impulse to action, but I'm saying speed can crowd out thoughtfulness, right? If you can be sufficiently thoughtful and quick, that's better. But speed for speed's sake is not better than being thoughtful, especially when it comes to producing art, which is going to stand the test of time. And guess what? That's what appreciates in value. So I do think the space needs to think about its incentive structures. And, this idea, so let me give you an example of something we're going to do, which I think is indicative of how you can plan on longer horizons and still be relevant. So in 2027, we're going to open an exhibition called High Style, the Art and Culture of Cannabis Pipes. Because we're the glass city, right? Most pipes and bongs are made of glass, and they're really incredible artists, jewelry makers, glass artists. This is their medium. They're doing incredible things, right? We decided to do that show like 4 years ago because it was very obvious that the rate of regulation, right, was proceeding towards greater acceptance, and that this would be relevant whether we did it in 2026 or 2029, right? So actually, like, catching a trend is not necessarily like a day trade, right? There are longer cycles than, Reddit posting. So I'm not suggesting that people can't be incredibly thoughtful and do incredible things very quickly. I'm suggesting that there are other ways to do things very thoughtfully. And sometimes the impulse to speed can crowd out thoughtfulness and therefore quality.
Yeah, that's a really good thought. Kind of like parallel something that I read in one of the articles or interviews you did. I think it was for ArtNet, where you said innovation doesn't always mean disruption. And I think it goes along the same lines. I wanted to ask you about that line. Like, could you expand a little bit on not just how you see that and you're implementing in a museum, but also how it could potentially apply to digital art and Web3?
Yeah, so there are, obviously there reams of literature on sort of innovation, approaches to innovation, the nature of innovation. Um, but someone that I like to quote, because it's down to the individual level rather than the organizational level, is a guy named Jeff DeGraff, who is a professor at the University of Michigan at Ross School of Business. And he's got a very accessible book called Innovation U that you can read, but identifies basically four different types of innovation. So you can be a disruptive innovator, a creator, and that is a type of innovation. You can innovate in process, right? That would be what you would call a control innovator. You can innovate in the way groups collaborate, communication processes, et cetera, what you would call sort of a collaborator. Um, uh, and then, uh, and then whatever blue is, I can't remember the fourth one offhand, but he color codes them. I got green, red, and yellow in there. But there are different ways of innovating. So your like CFO who designs a brand new process to close the books each month, 3 days faster. That's innovation, even though it's not creating something brand new. So innovation is offering something new, right? That is an improvement. So there are lots of different ways for that to take hold. And certainly, as we think about it at the museum, we have, as I've shared in other contexts, we've given a lot of thought to where we innovate and how we innovate, where we should be sort of in the broader sort of cycle of innovation at any given point. But yeah, I mean, you don't have to create something from scratch. You don't have to disrupt the world. You can improve things at the margin, and that's also innovation.
Um, I'm actually going to use this because it's just perfect to just go into the last couple of minutes of our conversation, talk about obviously it's a Meebits podcast, but let's start with Larva Labs. You had CryptoPunks there at Infinite Images, obviously Matt and John, incredible innovators, engineers, artists, punks, kind of, obviously in the pantheon of at least, NFTs and Web3, and I think long term, just art history overall. Meebits is their second character project that kind of was, I think, in my opinion, ahead of its time. Now, in this world that we live in, where to your point, right, people think that speed is better than long term relevance, what would you, if you have any thoughts on kind of like the dynamics of Larva Lab's body of work and how Meebits fit in from like a museum director point, to put you in the hot seat here for a second?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Matt and John, so have for a decade produced like very few all iconic projects. So like if ever you wanted an example of what it looks like to be super thoughtful and the output being better, that's your example, right? Not just punks, but glyphs, which were in the show, right? Now Meebits. And when you ask them what's next, they're like, we're working on it, right? You might know, right? I really enjoy getting to know them. I don't know, I'm not close enough with them yet to know, but I respect them so much. I think they're really, really thoughtful. And I think it shows in the work that they produce.
We're almost out of time here. We really appreciate you coming on. I know it's really exciting times over at Toledo. You guys have the big, what do you call it, rehang next year, redoing the whole museum. Now you have I'm going to butcher this word, but like the coin stuff coming over.
Yeah, just the coin stuff. The coin
stuff. Yeah, I'm Mexican, man. I'm ESL. They didn't teach me in high school. I'll work on pronouncing it better next time you and I chat so I can surprise you with it. But before I let you go, Adam, I did ask the Meebits community for some questions, and I think we tapped most of them. The one that somebody asked that he wanted you to answer, please, was, what was the inspiration for the name Maroon 5?
Oh, yeah, I know, right? So look, I was actually hoping to get through today without someone making that joke, but thank you.
I'm sorry.
No, it's good. So my rejoinder is always, there's only one person in the world who wishes I were him more than me, and that's my wife. So his middle name is Noah, evidently, and mine is Michael, so it's not exactly the same name. But he is older, so he had the name first. But I do feel like people know that it's not that uncommon of a name.
Yeah. But it is a pretty famous uncommon name.
It's true. No, but look, there are worse people to share names with.
Fair enough. I shared the birthday with Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, see, that's not ideal. Well, and it was funny when we were doing work with Yatreda because, of course, Kia, his husband Joey, is Joey Lawrence, so it was sort of like Joey Lawrence and Adam Levine. I do think you've gotten the sense that I travel a lot, which is true, and there are some benefits to that as well. Sort of, I do want to. I have seen more disappointed flight attendant faces than anyone ever should. They sort of read the manifest and they're like getting very excited, and then it's me. So, so I guess the answer to the question is I don't know how they came up with the name Maroon 5, but because of Maroon 5, I have become really good at managing other people's disappointment.
That's an amazing answer, man. You're so thoughtful. We always share. Alex Holt, former co-founder with me of my previous company. You guys were college mates, and every time, you came up. I think we met first time in Austin Consensus. He had nothing but high praise for how you communicate and all the stuff you built around your life, and obviously all the things that you're doing, not just for the museum, the art space, but Toledo as a whole. So really, really grateful for you for being here today, having this conversation. Kind of like all over the place, but that's the way the Meebits podcast go. Really excited for what Toledo has coming up. Again, I think I've told everybody that I'm friends with, I think you can't miss whatever Toledo does next year. We got to go. And then Marfa, I think you're kind of like on that level of not just community, but appreciating the art for the art's sake and also just having fun. I think, there's no need for the art world to be so stuffy, which I think is one of the paradigms that I used to have as well, looking from the outside in. But it's a lot of fun and meeting people like yourself and everybody that's in the space. So again, I don't know if you have any final words for us for the Meebits podcast before we wrap it up.
Well, let me just, not a final word, but it's just hanging out over here. Just thought I would, show my Meebits tote that I rock around periodically. No, my final words are thank you for having me. Thanks to the community for listening. Come see the block party next year and follow what we're doing and encourage your local institutions to get involved.
Awesome. All right, well, you heard it here, folks. Toledo Museum of Art, Block Party 2026. Be there. And hopefully one day we'll see the Meebits in there too.
We're working on it.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much, Adam.
Take care, Sergio. Have a good one. Thanks for having me.